UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
I'm really excited we were able to pull this one off.
So am I. It was during MidWest WeirdFest, which is a festival I run in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which screens horror and sci-fi and underground cinema with a particular focus on paranormal documentaries. And we literally walked out of the screening of the finale of this fantastic TV series. Night of Pan is the name of the episode. And we were able to cross the road from the Micon Downtown Cinema, which is the wonderful venue where the festival takes place, and take the two creators with us across the road and up to Ivy, which is this wonderful collective creative space where we hold our closing night party and where we hold our filmmaker forum. And also we were lucky to get access to this space at 10:30 on a Saturday night to be able to use their podcast studio. So yeah, I'm very happy that we were able to pull it off as well.
Yes. And it was right up your alley too.
It really was. I think not only are you and I massive fans of this show, but as the listeners are probably now getting used to and perhaps sick of, it's very clear that I have a considerable interest in the writings of John Keel and Jacques Vallee and thinkers like that who wrote in the paranormal and UFO field. And John Keel is an obvious influence on this series.
I also think we should mention that while at MidWest WeirdFest, the Hellier Season 2 documentary series won Best Series, and Karl Pfeiffer was able to snag Best Director, which I know we both were very excited about. I guess with that being said, I think it's perfect timing to get the ball rolling. Here are two of the creators of Hellier who not only developed and implement a range of unique paranormal investigation techniques, but they also created the most intriguing and original documentary series on the topic today. Here is Greg Newkirk and Karl Pfeiffer.
Okay, man, is it warm in here or is it me? In fact,
I don't feel too bad.
I'll tell you a story. We just came from the Hellier screening at MidWest WeirdFest, and an audience member came to me immediately after the screening, and she's been to screenings before, and she was all flushed and she was all red, and she whispered to me. She said, "The room changed." And I went, "What?" And she said, "The theatre changed when they were talking about the numbers. Something happened in there. It got hot." And she was really freaking out. Like it really bothered her. That was. I wasn't going to say who it was, but
Yeah, way to go, Karl.
Are we recording?
we're recording, yeah.
Oh, we're already
but that's okay. I just go and then we can find, rather than being, okay, well, we're going now.
Yeah.
But we are going now. So what was it like watching the film on a big screen tonight, which we just did?
It was crazy. This is the first time we really got to see it. And so I think there was that question, we've seen it on all small screens. We've seen it on our friends' TVs, but we haven't seen it on a theater screen yet. And it was wild. It was awesome.
I don't know if you want to do a little backstory. I'm hoping that most listeners know what Hellier is, but I mean, we could talk about it first. But we watched the final episode tonight where you guys do a specific ritual in a cave. And I talked about it in the Q&A, and I talked about it to you before. But when I was watching it myself, it bothered me that there was this ritual playing out in my living room. And like the coward that I can be when it comes to these things, I had to turn it off halfway through the ritual and come back a day later to break the ritual, because I didn't want to. But it's funny when I came back to it, because you said something similar, Karl, when it cuts to you. So you had a similar feeling of what the effect that might have on people.
Yeah, there's absolutely an element of Hellier that's very much that ritual that we did always felt a little bit bigger than the space that it was. I'm not sure if that's because we were worried about, concerned with the lack of like stuff happening. We did this ritual. Like, is it going to be producing anything? Are we going to have any ghostly type experiences or anything manifest? And as the ritual wound down, as you see in the episode, it very much started to make us wonder if this wasn't just another part of a bigger thing. And the whole season before that is dealing with this idea that we're part of a big ritual, that we're part of an initiation. And so when you start to realize as a filmmaker myself that this ritual that I'm filming is also going out and being broadcasted into living rooms, you start to realize that maybe the time frame of this ritual that we're doing is not the here and now at that moment, but also the here and everything thereafter.
Uh-huh. It's funny because both Jen and I loved Hellier before we knew we were screening you. But I know it must be the most divisive supernatural show that or paranormal show I've ever been aware of.
It's certainly, I mean, it's always one, when you're in it, you obviously have opinions about it. But as someone who's consumed paranormal media my entire life, I used to watch, MTV's Fear and World's Scariest Places and all that kind of stuff. That's what I grew up on. I've never seen a response to any show the way that we've seen with Hellier, where it's like the first season's very interesting because it has a solid, nice 3-star rating, but not because people are rating it 3 stars. It's because 40% of people are rating it 5 stars, saying this is incredible, it changed my life, and then there's 40% that are giving it 1 stars, and they're like, you didn't find any damn goblins. What's wrong with you? Why did I invest all this time? There's nothing here, and that's really intriguing to me.
I mentioned, and I have a couple times, the similarities of this to the Shaver mystery. And I know, but it's funny that was an incredibly divisive story as well. For listeners who might know, Ray Palmer published initially a story which Palmer kind of ghost wrote a little bit for somebody called Richard Shaver in Amazing Stories, I think it was, right back in the early to mid-40s. It was kind of like a proto-UFO phenomenon, really. There was meant to be this underground ancient civilization that was abducting people. And anyway, when that came out in Amazing Stories, it was polarizing in many ways as well. People jumped on board like crazy, and people screamed that they hated it like crazy. So,
well, I remember, I think even John Keel said he hated the Shaver mystery, but he had to give it credit because it launched a lot of the popularization of, UFO mythos. So I think there's a lot of people around us in our community that probably feel the same way, where they like begrudgingly have to give Hellier credit because we're trying to do the opposite of what paranormal television shows do. We're trying to we're talking about things like marginality and liminality and how everything is connected. And people are reading John Keel for the first time. People who wanted to see a goblin in Hellier, now they're reading books that they'd never read before. So I think that the response is really interesting because it's a passionate response from either part of the spectrum. I mean, it's interesting to me that people love it as much as they do, but it's also interesting to me that there are some people who just absolutely hate it, loathe it. Still interesting.
And there's another commonality with the Shaver thing, which I mentioned earlier in the Q&A tonight as well. When that story came out, obviously you can say, well, it's crazy, there's no people in the caves, but people came out of the woodwork responding, saying, I've been to the caves, I've seen these creatures, I've fought them, they've terrorized me my whole life. And something very similar in many ways happened with the release of Hellier.
Yeah, I mean, our inboxes are filled with stories of varying levels of intensity, where it's just as much as like, hey, I found a blue balloon right after I watched that episode, all the way up to literally, I've been in the caves. I've seen these things. I've seen the little creatures. Or my grandparents used to talk about the holler goblins. And I'm so glad to see somebody finally talking about this. Or I have information. I mean, I've got emails, at least half a dozen, from people who are like, oh, I know Terry Wrist too. That type of thing. Whether or not that's true, I don't know.
I think, so we've talked about the polarization, but there's something also about it which I think is also kind of responsible perhaps for the division. And that's across the various paranormal groups, whether they're people who are, specter hunting, or whether they're UFO people, or whether they're into Bigfoot. People have traditionally liked to keep those categories very separate. And Hellier doesn't seem to make a distinction. It looks at it as a broader fusion perhaps, or an umbrella something which goes over these. Very much like John Keel did, who I know who's clearly influential. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've both kind of come from that perspective too. I think as people, everyone on the team really, there's very much growing up in a background of just like a love for the paranormal, whether that's in like the 90s or the 80s when UFOs were hot back then. And I think a lot of us, like I started with aliens, and I was really into the aliens in the 90s. The X-Files was a big deal. Unsolved Mysteries sightings, that's what I cut my teeth on. But then the ghost hunting shows kicked off late when I was in high school. And that seemed like the avenue to kind of go down to explore this stuff. It was a little bit easier than standing in the backyard staring at the sky. You could actually go to some places and do some things that you're seeing on TV. So you got the idea of how to do them. And that was kind of the career for the next decade. And so I think that having that background of being interested in it all, and then having come across Keel throughout that process, someone that's into the mysterious and the unknown in general, I just want to make it weird. I just want to get as weird as I can with it. And so very much for me, that's in keeping with what I want from it and what I enjoy about it. And to then, even in the first episode, before we even knew how much Keel and Mothman was going to be involved in this, we're doing our first round of interviews about the original story that Greg and Dana had. And Greg talks about how he's always liked that Keelian kind of approach where it just brings it all together under one umbrella and it finds those similarities between them. But even at that point, Greg had been harping on that topic for a while. I mean, Bigfoot is a ghost became kind of a catchphrase for his Planet Weird stuff with Dana.
I mean, I think the longer that you take the topic seriously, and, you know, I came from a ghost background. Like, that's how I met my wife. We were rival ghost hunters. And so I grew up with the ghost thing. Like, that was my thing. But then one day I decide I'm going to go hang out with some local Bigfoot hunters. And I start to see the things that they talk about that often go unsaid, whether it's like strange lights or like feeling hypnotized or seeing the footprints just stop and no one knows where they go. And I start to go, oh, Bigfoot's probably a poltergeist. Like if coming at it from a ghost perspective. And so that's where I started. And the further we go down this road and the more stuff we read by like Keel and you know, Vallee and a plethora of other authors and researchers, the more it seems obvious that a lot of the biggest problems in the paranormal can be solved by this overarching theory that it's all somehow coming from the same place. And potentially that place is, you know, inside our own heads, which doesn't necessarily make it not real. It just means that there's something more fascinating going on than we ever could have figured. But it's a tough pill to swallow for you know, nuts and bolts, flesh and blood people. You know, where they wanted a goblin, and instead they got magic rituals. And
they sure did. And obviously Greenfield's book was a serious influence. I mean, I don't even have to say that to anybody who's...
No, I mean, we wouldn't have... I mean, Hellier would not be here if it wasn't for Greenfield's book. Greenfield's book is such an integral part of the research and the initial story. Greenfield, and I'm sure Greenfield loves it. I'm sure we were very afraid of Greenfield at first. We thought we had this picture in our minds of this, like, you know, thelemic magician who's like dressed all in black, and we're gonna maybe he is Terry Wrist, and we were so nervous to meet him. And then he shows up like in a Hawaiian shirt, and he's just like complete antithesis of everything we expected from this guy who was this looming ghost over the entire case the whole time. And he's still, like, you know, we still email him all the time. He's always got ideas. And I think Greenfield, his book and his following, the book after after Secret Cipher of the UFOnauts, Secret Rituals of the Men in Black. Those two things are very, very important, very big.
Maybe there's a cult of people who wear Hawaiian shirts. When I met Jim Mosley back in the day in Florida, he was wearing a Hawaiian shirt.
Right.
And they were buddies too, right?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. Gosh. Maybe that's a sign. Maybe by you know, Hellier season 13, we'll all be wearing Hawaiian shirts.
Jeez, you have to.
We'll be really initiated then.
I've heard they're coming back. I've heard rumors.
I wanted to ask you a question because when I first watched Hellier, I'll be honest, I don't like to be disingenuous with people. When I saw the tin can thing, I was really mixed, right? I saw it and I went, I have to cut that swearing out. This is a show which is appropriate for the whole family. When I watched that scene with the tin can, and then you guys made such a big deal about it, I was like, I've been all over the place and there's crushed cans, but there's something about it that niggled at me, right? And it wasn't necessarily what you talk about, because you guys discover a tin can and Connor's already seen a vision or heard something about it, right, just to fill people in. But it wasn't what you drew was that, and I was certainly familiar with it, John Keel writing about these weird little robotic automated tin can things.
Right.
But there's somebody else that's central to Secret Cipher of the UFOnauts. And I don't know, do you know very much about Philip K. Dick?
Yeah, of course. VALIS. And all that.
So you're familiar with
Yeah,
VALIS?
Yeah.
So do you know about the VALIS tin can?
I don't know about that.
Oh my goodness, get ready, baby. Get ready.
Is this your big thing?
This is my big thing I've been waiting all weekend to tell you.
So here's I have a copy of VALIS that I got. I mean, I've always been familiar with Philip K. Dick, but not like I'd never read VALIS. I didn't know about it. And then Hellier comes out, and people are like, "It seems like you're talking to a vast
articulate
living intelligence system." Yeah. But I've had a copy of it since the first season, and I've not cracked it yet. So
here's the thing: I'm going to crack it for you.
Oh God!
Greenfield talks about VALIS a lot in that book.
Well, one of the rituals that Greenfield gives in it actually mentions VALIS.
The one of calling down the fish-headed people.
Oannes. Yeah. Which Greenfield warned us about, by the way.
Oh, we'll have to get into that maybe in a minute. Yeah. But here's what it's interesting too. Was what was talking about Greenfield and his interpretation, and this was interesting. Greenfield thinks VALIS is the demiurge, which is in Gnostic or alternative religious beliefs, an evil creator god. And he thinks Dick was... I'm sorry. Hang on.
We're having too much fun here.
Yeah, we are. He thought Dick and other people are sometimes led astray by the Black Lodge and perhaps whatever the intelligence is above the Black Lodge. And he goes on to start calling it VALIS. This is Greenfield in the book. Now, P.K. Dick has a very different interpretation of VALIS. If you've read VALIS or if you've read Radio Free Albemarle, VALIS is clearly something which is trying to give spiritual enlightenment to P.K. Dick. And VALIS is a semi-autobiographical book. That's what's so fascinating. It's part sci-fi. It part deals with Dick's own strange Gnostic Christianity and this very weird experience he had where his reality seemed to melt. Was the old Roman Empire somehow imprinted on ours? Was God talking to him? Was it three-eyed beings from Sirius? Or maybe that was
information about his
son's testicular. He had some kind of hernia, and the son would have died, but this pink light showed him the way.
Yeah.
So VALIS is a force for good. But in the book VALIS, this is why I've always loved this book. Halfway through the book, P.K. Dick and his alter ego, Horse Lover Fat, go in to see the movie version of VALIS, which the book's also called, and there's a movie in it called VALIS. It's in many ways what the other kind of VALIS book called Radio Free Albemarle is. It's kind of condensed in there. And they see a representation of VALIS in that film, which keeps coming up again and again and again. And what was the representation of VALIS? A crushed can?
No.
Absolutely. And Dick finishes the book talking about it again and saying that's where the divine shows up as trash at first.
Yeah.
That's really interesting to have because it's another thing going back. There's like 4 things I could address of all of that, but specifically the idea of like the divine showing up as trash is something that we've seen a lot of stuff akin to in fairy lore. So if you're going back to like the Jacques Vallee type stuff, you get these consistent stories about people who accidentally wind up in the fairy realm, right? Like whether it's the fairies come out and they're like, we need someone to help us give birth or whatever. We need you to like come officiate a wedding, whatever like the weird fairy story is. They will typically give payment to that human being. And they give it to them in a bag and they go, don't look at it until you're back in the real world. And then it becomes kind of one of those, like biblical type tales where like the people who look, the ones that look halfway through find that their bag is just full of trash and garbage. But the ones who don't make it the whole way back home and they find its riches and gold and value. And we compared that so much to our experiences in Hellier and Somerset in the first 2 seasons where we're constantly being given trash that we're finding value within in more ways than one. And so that theme of the divine in the trash is very fascinating and recurring.
But it's also interesting when you have that mindset and you look at the way people respond to Hellier. I always kind of, maybe this isn't accurate, but it typically seems to me that the non-magical people, the people who live in mundane reality, they go, so what? They found trash. But it's the people who either have been initiated or are already initiated that go, look at the treasure that they found.
Gotcha. And the interesting thing just while we're with VALIS is VALIS good or is VALIS bad? Because according to Dick, VALIS is good. But according to Greenfield, VALIS is bad. So that's inversion of values. So in that tin can, it was representative of VALIS. If something's guiding you, like the Black Obelisk in 2001, A Space Odyssey, or the Eighth Tower in Keel, if something external is guiding you, whatever we call it, then the question becomes: is VALIS good or bad, or is it the Black Lodge, or is it the White Lodge, or what's actually the thing which is as I think you're both aware of, because you've spoken about it a lot now, that something seems to be guiding you on this ritual experience or something.
I think, like I'm sure Greg would say that, he comes from a half in, half out perspective. I myself, like, since studying a lot of like mysticism in college, I very much became acquainted with the distinctions between like Eastern and Western religious and mystical culture, and how in the West it's very polarized between good and evil, light and dark, two specific sides. Whereas in more Eastern culture, you see a holistic kind of more of the shades of gray. Like you can't have one without the other. They operate together, very much like that. And so I've always kind of appreciated that, because, the older you get, the more you see how gray everything is, that aren't at the extremes. And I think that that's part of where I found the kinship with Greg and Dana, is they have very much always kind of embodied, maybe not in so many words, but that kind of pursuit with their own background in the museum and whatnot, in the unwillingness to jump to the conclusion that something's evil and scary, breaking that paradigm that just like, if it seems frightening, it's definitely evil, because there's so much of that. It's such an easy thing to do in popular culture these days. And that's very much like a paradigm that we don't want to reinforce, and that we also recognize leads very quickly to a paranoia rabbit hole. And we're all familiar with like Keel and the way that he was open-minded and then quickly was like, no, this stuff is bad. We don't want to mess with this. So I think we're open to the fact that like there could be badness, but we're also trying not to like jump to that conclusion and second guessing it too much at this point yet, if we're not seeing any sort of overt bad. And maybe that's playing with fire, because maybe if it gets bad, then it's all over. But I think that it's the safest approach, even just for our mental sake.
I mean, we very well could. There could come a day where we're like, wow, we really screwed up. What did we do? We unleashed a mimetic virus onto the population. But I don't necessarily think that it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, one of our mottos is curiosity through fear, because you don't learn anything when you're afraid. And that can, the sort of secret, not so secret message behind the work that Dana and I do with our museum is like, people have an idea. We get compared to like Ed and Lorraine Warren a lot, but it's really a superficial thing because of what we do. But once they come to our lectures or they come to the museum, they realize our message is always, if you're afraid of that thing in the dark, you'll never be able to turn on the light switch. You'll never know what it is that's scaring you. And maybe sometimes it's just misinterpretation that's scaring you. And so, I think maybe one of the messages that subtly in there with Hellier, because of the way that we approach the phenomena, is if you can learn to not be afraid of this supernatural thing that scares you, maybe you won't be so afraid of your neighbor who has a different belief system than you. So we try to continuously press forward through the things that we're afraid of, because that's how you learn stuff. You don't learn anything if you're just scared. You end up going, nope, here's a wall. Right. And that's that.
Even from an alchemical aspect, which is something I looked at a lot in college, there's the element, the problem of evil, even if you will, like why do bad things happen? But the alchemical process in an ideological fashion is based on the idea that like kind of purification comes through suffering. Like if you want to build muscle, you have to rip muscle down first. And if you want to purify water, you have to boil it, like sometimes it's a violent process. And so the idea being like, I also kind of try to be open about like bad things, seemingly maybe perhaps destructive things, like also breeds like new life. And so that's the sort of like open-mindedness that I try to, not cynical as I can be. That's the sort of like cosmic open-mindedness that I try to bring to it, where it's like bigger picture or just patience. Just, it doesn't always necessarily have to be too bad on the surface.
So that's the message to remember when we wind up dead, and Hellier 3 is a found footage film.
That's the message to remember when we rip a portal open and the old gods all come out and we
tear our eyes out.
We're just like, well, it's the new eon, so there you go.
We laugh about it now, but
it's true. It's true. This podcast interview will be part of that found footage documentary.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to learn about your experiences, like your very first experience. I mean, have you ever seen a Bigfoot, aliens, your first ghost, anything like that?
I've not seen a Bigfoot, but I've been yelled at by one.
Okay.
There were a couple guys out of West Virginia who, I think one of the other things that I try and do is it gets harder now these days. This is a lot harder, but I try and hang out with like the craziest, kookiest people I can find.
Well, you're hanging out with Tyler Strand.
That's true. That's how Tyler. And I think by doing that, you learn a lot of things, and sometimes those people are tapped in to something. You just find that sometimes these people who seem crazy are really tapped in. And there were these two guys. We had seen them in a documentary called Not Your Typical Bigfoot Movie, which is a fantastic documentary if you've not seen it. Dallas and Wayne. We went out. They offered to take us out to their Bigfoot hotspot. And these guys were just like, they were talking about Bigfoots coming through portals. They were talking about like, Wayne told this amazing story about how he was walking through the woods and he all of a sudden looked around him and all the trees were huge and he was in a prehistoric world. And when we asked him what he was doing, he said he was out picking mushrooms. So It's stories like that where we're just like, oh God, well, we're not going to find anything, but this is going to be a fun story. That night, we are sitting around the campfire and all of a sudden these massive things start screaming and throwing rocks at us. And like, I was so scared because I didn't expect to see anything. I went and I hid in the van. I was like, these things are going to kill us. Whatever this is, they're huge. They were huge, giant, like typical Bigfoot screams. And Dallas and Wayne just sat there and they're just like, I don't know why anybody doesn't believe us. Nobody ever believes us, but it happens out here all the time. And so yeah, I've had a lot of situations like that usually come from following something that I typically would not follow. I have a pretty crazy experience that way. So yeah, my long story short, I've not seen Bigfoot, but I've been screamed at by Bigfoot.
Yeah, I've lived the much more sheltered life in some ways than Greg Newkirk, where I'm less likely to go meet any stranger that it seems like a weirdo.
He just does that with us.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's why I hang out with these guys because they're my resource for that. But so it's been a very gradual thing for me because it started with this like passion my whole life and enjoyment of this phenomena. And wanting validation from it. I wanted to have that crazy experience. When you cut your teeth on so many of those shows, you're just like, that experience is out there. Let me go find it. And so it really started for me when I was on Ghost Hunters Academy 10 years ago. And I was like, I'm finally out there. I'm going to some of the best Ghost Hunters legendary locations. Let's see what's up. The first episode, we heard like footsteps in the hallway where there wasn't anyone there. We heard like a whispered sigh in between me and another investigator. And I was like, okay, kind of a quiet start, that's it's not quite a great episode of Ghost Hunters, but that's an interesting start. And then the next like 4 or 5 episodes, like nothing happened to me, just total jack. So that was kind of like a big wake up call where I was like, wow, it really is that rare. And so it was going to the Stanley Hotel after that I got to build up my opportunities for those experiences and further reinforce the rarity of them. And it was very gradual, subtle. There's a lot of stuff that would happen on some nights that if I wasn't documenting it, like it fades. It's so mild. I swear there's probably more mild experiences that I've had that I've forgotten than the more interesting ones that I remember. But there were certainly a handful, the stuff as simple as like a great EVP or a great disembodied voice that you hear. It was very rare that I would ever see anything. I would suppose some people are more tuned into that than others. But I think that kind of like got me in touch more than anything with like my kind of personal senses. I don't ever claim to be sensitive. I'm far from it. Most investigations, I'm more of a rock, but the ability to go back to a place week after week after week. I worked there, did 250 investigations on the property over 5 years. The ability to go back to a place that feels one way for 3 months. And then you walk in one night and you go, something's different here. Something's weird. There's a weird vibe. That was like a very interesting kind of like gradual experience for me, is to start to recognize those environmental shifts that aren't based on predispositions or, a spooky story somebody told me right before I walked in. So I've had plenty of like interesting experiences as well that are more tangible than that. But I wanted to have that early experience that just knocked me flat on my butt. And it doesn't really, I think for some it works that way, but it didn't really work that way for me. It's been much more of a subtle kind of a rise. And it's something I bring to Hellier now too, where I want that crazy experience. I still do, but I appreciate the rarity and finding the value in the subtlety now. Hence the tin can kind of a moments where when you experience that, you can appreciate it. But from the outside, you're just like, okay, but where's the goblins?
Right.
I get that. I totally get that too.
Speaking about Bigfoot, though, and speaking about people who keep searching and searching and searching, one of my favorite documentaries you made, Greg.
Oh God.
Yeah, come on.
You're gonna spike the popularity. Now people are gonna ask me where to see it.
They're gonna, yeah. And it's Bigfoot. I always get the title confused. So it's Bigfoot Hunter Still.
The Bigfoot Hunter
Still
searching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's an example, though, of somebody who just keeps looking and looking.
Oh, he's still.
Yeah.
Yeah. He does. We met this guy. It's actually a really funny story. He was part of the reason why I expanded my horizons away from just ghosts and spirits. I was getting groceries and I was in the line, and like, you remember the Weekly World News? Everybody loves the Weekly World News. It doesn't exist anymore. I think they have an online website now, but it was like, if you were a kid in like the 80s and 90s, it was the classic. You would pick it up and you'd read about Bat Boy or how like Bill Clinton met an alien and whatever. Bigfoot had my baby. And so like I was reading through it and I didn't realize it, but the magazine had classified ads, and I saw a classified ad that said, the Southern Tier Bigfoot Research Society, Elmira, New York, and it had a phone number and an office. And I went, holy crap, that is half an hour from me. I called all my friends. I said, we're going to go and talk to these people. And I remember so distinctly showing up at the office. And we could hear, and it was the craziest thing because it was in an office building. So there were like doctors and lawyers and optometrists and all these people in this very serious. And then there was like Southern Tier Bigfoot Watch. And we took the elevator up, like 3rd floor. And the closer we get, we can hear like kung fu noises coming out of the room. And it's a Bruce Lee movie playing. And we just sat there and we're like, what are we getting ourselves into? And we knocked on the door, and this giant of a man opens the door, dressed head to toe in camo. And he had been like scratching his chest or something, so his like gut was hanging out of his shirt. And he goes, hey, I know you. You're the ghost hunters. And he had been on our website, and he invited us in, and he had been living in this room. He had a cot there. He had been living in this office, and he had a giant map on the wall of all the local Bigfoot sightings, but it was in crayon. And this guy was such an insane character. We said, you have to take us out on a Bigfoot hunt. And he did, and that's actually what the Bigfoot Hunter Still Searching documents is, our first trek out with this guy, where he's like, we're teenage kids, and he's handing us like loaded weapons and saying, giving us advice like, you got 6 shots, use the 5 to try and kill it if it comes at you. If you don't kill it by 5, turn the gun around and shoot yourself because you don't want to know what's going to happen next.
That's the clip you see in Hellier episode 1 is always save the last round for yourself.
Yeah, it's just so good. It's fantastic. It's funny, though, this was another question I wanted to ask you, and it's weird how it segued. You were talking about Bruce Lee then. When I was watching Hellier, and I'm nowhere near into paranormal investigation documentaries as Jen is, but to me what it seemed that how you approached it with the Estes technique and with the God helmet thing and with following like the detectives following a synchronicity trail and Dana doing her magic, it almost seemed like a Jeet Kune Do. Like if you know about Bruce Lee's martial art, he had a background in Wing Chun, and then he said, well, this is the boxing stance is good for this, and the fencing thing is good for this, and so he brought all of these traditional martial arts together and started a new martial art. And it seems like that's almost the way that you guys have approached this type of investigation, putting all these things together to have a new way of doing an investigation.
Yeah. It's absolutely kind of a part of Greg and Dana's background. I think it's interesting, and I can let him elaborate on more of kind of like how some of those techniques develop, but we were coming off of Spirits of the Stanley, my kind of first web series where I was kind of cut my teeth on how to do filmmaking. And Connor, myself, and Michelle Tate at the Stanley Hotel developed the Estes method to talk to ghosts, utilizing the ubiquitous spirit box. We modified it by putting headphones and a blindfold on and listening to the box and saying the answers. It was very successful at the Stanley. It was very compelling and fascinating. And so as we went on this Goblins case, at this point, we're like well-versed in like the Vallee and the Keel, where it's just kind of like these things. We didn't go down to Hellier looking for the remnant goblins, the remnant aliens of a crashed ship from 50 years before, we went down to it being like, there could be Fae connection here. This could be something much more spiritual. And so coming off of this hot technique, we're like, well, let's try this. And we had a really compelling session there where it seemed like we were getting some sort of engagement. The synchronicities gave it to that more spiritual idea. But it was a shot in the dark. Like, we were at a cabin that wasn't even like particularly close to Hellier. It was close enough for government work, so to speak. But it was a shot in the dark. And so if nothing had come from that session, it could have very much changed the trajectory of the Hellier investigation. That was more of an attempt to say, if this is a non-physical thing, let's see if we can get in touch. And it seemed to be, in some sense, successful. That promoted us to do more stuff as we went on with it. Whereas if that had been a very dead, boring session, we might have gone, yeah, let's go more of the cryptid angle with this, and let's get a little bit more flesh and blood with it. And that led to a lot of techniques that Greg and Dana had been working on and developing that continued to sort of like push this more, not only non-physical idea, but the role of the observer's brain in the experience being more of a subconscious or astral type experience of these entities. And that's what we pursued a lot in season 2.
I think the longer you do this, I think you find this with a lot of paranormal investigators too. The longer they start to do this type of work, the more they start to hate the gadgets. Like, the gadgets are fun. They've got blinky lights. I mean, they look good on TV, which is part of the reason why everybody uses them. But I think the secret that you start to learn is that the best tool you really have is yourself. You can gut check when something, like Karl briefly touched on the fact that, like, he's being at the Stanley Hotel for as long as he has, he's able to hone his gut. So, like, he knows that the vibe is different when he walks. Like, it's funny because Karl is a lot more level-headed than a lot of the rest of us. We maybe have a little more 2 feet in than Karl does. But when Karl goes, something's setting off my spooky sense, we all take notice of it too, because he knows. And I'm more interested and fascinated with how human consciousness plays a part in the paranormal. And the more we do this, the more I'm starting to I realize, or at least understand, that the final frontier of paranormal research is not the external, it's the internal, and how that affects the external. But that's a harder place to look. So I think there's a massive internal aspect to the Estes method, which Karl and Connor developed. Like, I hate spirit boxes. I hate ghost boxes. These guys made me start to be interested, but I don't know how it exactly works, but I think there's an internal mechanism there. And so that's why I got really interested in the work of Dr. Michael Persinger and the God helmet and the idea of how electromagnetic hotspots affect the brain, which is electromagnetic. There are electric pulses that operate the brain. And so what happens when you're in a place that's considered a holy site? Well, they typically have really weird high electromagnetic fluctuations that are probably tapping us in to something. And I think that happens in a lot of haunted homes too. You start to look around and realize, oh, well, the ghost hunters are half right, I think, where they're using electromagnetic field meters, thinking that when it beeps, that means they found a ghost. I don't think that's the case. I think it means that you found the conduit to potentially speaking with a ghost. And so I think that we are a big part of why paranormal activity manifests. And so I'm fascinated with stuff like the God helmet and with stuff like the Estes method and magic, ritual magic. It's all altered states. It's all tapping us. Hypnosis. We use a lot of hypnosis in Hellier. So things that allow us to tap into altered states, I think, just short of drug use, because we're asked that a lot too. They're like, that's clearly the path that you're on and you're getting there, so why don't you do DMT? The problem is, number one, we don't really want to advocate for that on television, but it also because of the view of drug use, I think that it automatically makes people not take you seriously. Right. So I think anything just short of that, I'm fascinated at how that has an effect on, the internal affecting the external.
And I think that goes back to Keel a little, with the whole idea of the super spectrum and
Absolutely.
something else. Yeah. And I always thought that term and the concept behind that was more useful than the term that he used, but Ivan T. Sanderson coined the phrase ultra-terrestrials, because ultra-terrestrials all of a sudden just means, as we were talking about the other night, that they're just from another dimension. They're still little grey men, they're just from another dimension.
Right.
While Keel himself said that was just a literary device. He never meant it to be that, that literal. So,
right. I mean, I think the longer we do this, the more I start to realize that it's the people that are haunted, not the homes that are haunted. And when you just watch, for example, one of my favorite paranormal television shows that did just everything I disagreed with, but I still enjoyed watching it because it was a beautiful show, was Paranormal State. Mm-hmm. And if you watch Paranormal State, you start to notice the places that they go and the people they talk to are in disarray. They're broken homes. They're homes that have you see where they're at. There's hoarding situations. Like things are wrong socially and familially in those places. My advice to a lot of those people would have just been to clean up your space and go to therapy and maybe do some art therapy and get those weird things that are happening inside from externalizing and creating these terrible hauntings. So I think you start to notice, we talk a lot about it in Hellier, the idea of marginalized people. Right. And liminal states, people that are, they have, maybe drug abuse problems, or they have maybe, family problems, or they're not taken seriously because of one thing or another. Those types of people, paranormal activity tends to manifest around. And so I think that it's the people that are haunted, and often maybe not necessarily the cause of the activity, but the conduit for it.
Right. It's interesting too, and this is something else Keel talked about, is that sometimes there's one person who has a lot of experiences, and when somebody else comes into their immediate field, it's almost like there's an umbrella of paranormal weirdness around that person. And Jenn, for example, has all kinds of weirdness happen all the time, and I think people in your life only have those experiences when they come into your life often. They didn't necessarily have those kind of experiences prior to it, right?
Right. Well, when I was last married, yes, the farmhouse that I lived in, I had a lot of experiences, mainly when my son was born. So I just took it because of that.
Yeah.
But I don't want to go in the whole thing, but I had a lot of odd experiences. But once I left, I still had experiences for myself. But my ex-husband said that as soon as I left, it was gone.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And I've heard that from other people too. But, I lived there for a good 10 years, and it was just horrid for me. But
so that comes back to your point about it's people who are haunted perhaps rather than the place.
But think about stories like Amityville, for example. If you buy into Amityville, one of the constant things that people talk about, they talk about the Conjuring house too. Mm-hmm. No one who's lived there afterwards has ever experienced a lick of activity. Right, yeah. But I think that's because the activity isn't necessarily about the property of the house. Maybe sometimes the house can act as an enhancement to it if the conditions are right. But I think it comes back to us, which, I think about that a lot while we do Hellier. And I think about how our experiences are influencing the activity and the phenomena that's happening around us. And then how Hellier transfers that as a visual project, how it transfers that to other people. And maybe that's part of this, initiation or ritual or whatever it is that spread of those ideas to other people who then start to experience synchronicity after they watch the series. Right. They just have these synchronicity storms because it's not so much the project, but what the project puts into someone's brain.
Right.
Are you seeing the way you approach Hellier at all yet having an impact on other researchers or other investigators or journalists? Because as I was saying, it's a different way of looking at things. And I can imagine, it does tie in a lot of those type beliefs we're talking about, Keel and Vallee and other people like that. There aren't many people in the field who are researchers pursuing the phenomenon in that way. So are you seeing yet anybody playing catch up with you guys or going in that direction a little?
I think it's still developing in a lot of ways. I think most of the stuff that you see and are aware of takes a little bit of time to grow. Mm-hmm. There's certainly that from a filmmaking aspect that I think we're going to see a lot more of this year. But from a structural research standpoint, I think it's there. I think I've less seen. I think a lot of the people that you see are in situations of being more locked into the traditional ways, like a lot of people you're aware of. I think if Hellier predated the new storm of paranormal TV rather than kind of drop at the same time of it, we might see more of that change in thinking. But I think a lot of the people that you see on TV right now, or at least maybe not TV per se, but the people you're aware of, I think are still operating in a more traditional sense because that's the stable, secure, the sure bet, the classical approach. I think we're seeing more of the grassroots sort of a move from it, where the stuff I see is the people who have adapted the Estes method, the fans, the fans that have they're posting so many pictures of the books they bought. That's what's crazy to me. That's the biggest crazy factor of Hellier for me is I used to give lectures about how you're not going to find proof of ghosts on a TV show because photo, video, audio doesn't mean anything on TV. And I stand by that. But if you want to find proof of ESP, there's dozens of books about it, about the scientific research. Scientific proof is going to be in writing. And so I was always advocating people to read books. I'm sure not too many people went home and bought some science books, but Hellier, we're getting tweets every day about the new book load that people just ordered off Amazon, and they got Mothman. They got books we didn't even talk about, which I love to see people going kind of out there and trying to find stuff to incorporate in.
Or they recommend us books.
Yeah.
That they're like, hey, you would like this book. You should read it. So Karl and I were just talking the other day. There was a podcast that was talking about Hellier, and they mentioned this book. And we both laughed because we both listened to the podcast on the way to the festival separately and told each other, I bought the book immediately. Huh. So that's what's so cool is that Hellier is this is an exaggeration, but it's a show about reading books because we do a lot of that.
It's a show that shows the values and the revelations that you can find by cracking a book. And so I think that the roots are there where there's a whole crew, a whole generation of people right now that are digging into that world and their brains are going to go. And whether or not that just turns into a more educated reflection of what they saw in Hellier or whether or not they start to pave their own paths. But I think you're going to see a lot more people that are let's try to use the Estes method when we go on a Bigfoot hunt, or let's try to apply something that I read in Mothman Prophecies to my UFO Skywatcher, whatever it is. I think we're going to see a lot more creative thinking in that regard inspired by Hellier. But I think it's going to take a little bit more time in a space that we're more aware of because I think it's building, it's growing.
I think visually we're going to start to see a lot of that stuff. I had a conversation there was a production team for a television show, which I will not name, that reached out and wanted to ask my opinion about how to research a supernatural Bigfoot sighting. And one of the things that they admitted was that they sent Hellier season 1 to their director of photography to pull inspiration from. And I noticed a little bit of that when the show came out. And I think we're going to see more of that type of thing. I think that it's going to have an effect on the way that some of these shows are made, or maybe they'll give the audience a little more credit. Because paranormal shows do not give the audience any credit. They just, it's very simple. It's either your grandma or a demon. It's one of the two things, there's no in between. And so I think that Hellier is proving that there is a space and a hunger for paranormal content that doesn't have to be dumbed down and can encourage a little more deep thought and maybe more open ends. So I think we'll start to see some of that. I wouldn't even be surprised if we start to really see a lot of that by the end of this year.
Yeah, I suspect you might be right as well.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be nice to get a little money from that, but if the only contribution that we're making is to try and maybe make people think a little bit deeper about the phenomena and not so boxed in, I guess that's okay too.
I guess I'll take the change in generational thinking and inspiration
over groceries.
I mean, but that's a big thing, I mean, it's interesting because I see something happening broadly today. I see a reinterest in Keel, and I think your show is a big part of that, incidentally. But I also see it's weird how it can be secular, this whole phenomenon, because I also see a rebirth in a serious examination of nuts and bolts stuff, which hasn't really existed after Condon. We see the To the Stars Academy stuff. We see all this interest in the Tic Tac video. So there's this. It's almost like after Condon, the University of Colorado UFO report in the late 60s, there was this clear division in ufology. There was the people who went the Jacques Vallee kind of way, and then there were the other people who held on to the science. But then I think in a way Keel went a little into the background. People didn't forget him, but he somehow, Keel and Vallee were always there, but X-Files type ufology kept it, in the other.
For sure. They're little green men.
Yeah, exactly. But now we're having a resurgence in the alternative way of looking at it at the same time that while Condon shut down the scientific community or anybody taking it seriously, it seems that all of a sudden again, it's being taken seriously at an extraterrestrial potential level as well, but also the Vallee Keelian type thinking, which comes to the forefront in Hellier.
Yeah, I think I would almost argue that there was a period in between there, but it emphasizes the secular nature of it, where I would say that the public awareness of Roswell and the time period of the X-Files in the 90s when I was cutting my teeth was still very nuts and bolts and little green men. What I think is really interesting about that, just the trivia detail, maybe this is just showing my age, but I thought Roswell was a thing since 1947. What I didn't realize until only a few years ago is that only hit the mainstream in the late 80s.
Absolutely.
And that's why everyone was talking about it in the 90s when I grew up, was because it was brand new information. So that was really interesting. So I think, and maybe it's colored too by me growing up as a kid where half of my UFO reading material was because my dad subscribed to Popular Mechanics for 10 years. And anytime there was a UFO on the cover, I was just like, this is my book, So I think that was a part of it. Seeing that Popular Mechanics connection to UFOs and the Area 51, it was all physical type stuff. What's interesting is I don't feel like I have much awareness of any of the Keelian balance to those scales in the 90s. It could be there. I'd be very curious if anyone has opinions, but that it feels relatively one-sided. The most Keelian balance would be the X-Files, given it's all mashed up. They might have a weird ghost episode or a UFO, whatever.
The Jose Chung's from Outer Space episode in season 3 is the classic example of Keelian thinking there. But you're right, most of it is government conspiracy, a Roswell crash, a little grey man, and a pact between the U.S. government and invading aliens, which was the main stay of UFO belief throughout the late 80s, throughout the 90s. You're absolutely right.
So I feel like, after the Conan report, when things kind of took that first deviance between more of the Vallee Keelian side and the nuts and bolts side, it was almost like the balance missed whatever instigator happened in the 90s. It missed that, and it was mostly nuts and bolts. And then it died down again. And now it's back where we've got all the, TTSA, and you've got the Tic Tac UFO, and you've got the government disclosure side of it, and you've got Hellier almost balancing that out.
I agree.
I wonder what it was in the 90s that missed the mark, that was supposed to be there having the Keelian stuff that didn't. Maybe it was just the pop culture element, the creative side of it, but I feel like that's almost like a missing piece. I'm brainstorming aloud right now.
You're right.
But
we had the Mothman Prophecies movie, but it didn't have the impact on culture that the X-Files did.
It flopped.
Yeah.
Well, it had an impact on me, which I think is interesting.
Yeah,
it's almost like the impact that was there, took 20 years to percolate back up after seeing it, which is an interesting kind of idea too, because that put a lot of stuff in my head just from the movie alone before I read the book.
I think too, it's nice to be able to go look at what Hellier's changing. Look at all the things that we're impacting. But I think it's probably more likely that again Hellier is just a symptom of something bigger that's happening, and the other people that it's happening to don't have the luxury of having really talented friends who can do, who can make the types of stuff that Karl makes, or the group of us that believe the things that we do. There's probably dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of other people that are experiencing that same type of initiation, but don't have the context to understand what's happening to them or how to tell that story. They don't have an outlet for it. So I think that, maybe we're just one, it's always nice to feel like you're special, but maybe we're not. Maybe we're special because of the group of people who found each other and are able to document this process as it happens.
It starts to go back to almost that Jungian perspective that we continuously come around to with all of our research, where there's the shadow side, the repressed side, the subconscious, the collective unconscious that manifests in archetypal fashion, that Hellier is a symptom in. That whole thing was manifesting for us at likely the same time it was manifesting for a bunch of people elsewhere, that, the rolling stone of it, or the snowball of it, is picking up, not from one singular source, but because a bunch of stuff started rolling at the same time.
I wonder if this interview will spread the Hellier virus out there. It's a little part of the spread. I think it keeps. I think it's going to keep growing. So
Surely.
I think everything that it touches is part of the spread. Whether that's good or not, I don't know. I think it's good, and I want to believe it's good, and I think I do believe that it's good, and that there is a positive. Like, it's funny to me. Again, the more distance you get, the more clarity you start to see, and it's not lost on me that we ended up in this direction where we're talking about Pan, this Earth spirit, whatever you want to say it is, at a time when a lot of people are starting to think that the Earth is in trouble, and there's a lot of like environmental discussion. And there are literally people who go out Helliering and pick up trash because they think it's important. It's just a silly example, but it is funny that is starting to become part of this narrative with Hellier is awakening the Earth spirit because maybe we need help. And whether that Earth spirit really exists or not, it does if enough people believe it. And when that happens, maybe the waking up of Pan, whatever Pan is more of a collective unconscious thing where people are like, ooh, I should maybe throw my garbage away. Maybe I should recycle. Maybe I should eat less meat or whatever it is. Even if it's a subconscious thing. I don't know. I think that might be an element of it too, but we'll see. We're in the midst of it, so I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, we will see. And you guys were just fantastic guests. Like, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh my God, I could talk for hours.
Yeah,
this
is
fantastic.
Great. It flew by. We could go another hour easy.
I know we could, but we just did the screening of Night of Pan at MidWest WeirdFest, and now I have to go and buy you guys a drink. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
We'll continue the discussion off air.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for coming on, guys. And when you do Hellier 3, we've got to get you back on again.
I will be here.
Absolutely.
I do have to say, after this interview, I think I'm even more inspired by Greg Newkirk and Karl Pfeiffer. I have been a huge fan of theirs from their early paranormal investigation days, and now because of their compelling investigation methods and the brilliant mindset displayed in Hellier, I am even a bigger fan now. I truly hope their documentary series leaves everyone spellbound, just like it did Dean and I. You can find Season 1 and Season 2 of Hellier at the official Planet Weird site at weirdhq.com, as well as on Amazon Prime and YouTube. At weirdhq.com, you can also find more information about Greg and Dana Newkirk's Museum of the Paranormal and Occult and their other projects. With most of us locked down during the COVID-19 crisis, I recommend supporting Greg and Dana Newkirk at patreon.com/paramuseum. As a patron, you will have access to their live stream investigations and more, and you will be helping Greg and Dana stay on top of their museum expenses through this trying time when public appearances are all but impossible. I have to say, I really do admire what Greg and Dana put out into this world, so please stop by and show them some support. With Karl winning Best Director at MidWest WeirdFest, I know even more people will be interested in seeing his talented directing and photography skills. You can see more of his work at karlpfeiffer.com. To support them further, you can stop by Facebook and like Planet Weird and Karl Pfeiffer's photography page. If you are interested in checking us out, you can find us on Facebook as well at Talking Weird Podcast, or you can find us at talkingweird.com. Next week, we have a very special person lined up for you that you really should not miss. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.